listening to the Chapter a Day Bible Study. I'm John Stange, and today we're in 1 Samuel 17, David and Goliath. Most people know 1 Samuel 17 as the story of David and Goliath. It's one of the best-known accounts in all of Scripture, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. Many people read it primarily as a lesson about facing the giants in their own lives. And while there's certainly principles of courage and faith in this passage, this chapter points us to something much greater. It's ultimately about God's glory, God's chosen king, and God's victory over the enemy. And most importantly, this chapter points us to Jesus. The chapter opens with the armies of Israel and the Philistines facing one another across the valley of Elah. Each day, a giant warrior named Goliath would step forward to challenge Israel to send a champion to fight him. Goliath was over 9 feet tall, he was heavily armored, and he was terrifying in appearance. His weapons alone weighed more than many soldiers could comfortably carry. And every day for 40 days, he would mock Israel, and he defied the living God. And the result was predictable. In verse 11, we read this: "When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." This is a bit ironic to read because Saul, the king who stood head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel, and we see this back in 1 Samuel 9, verse 2, he was nowhere to be found. Saul had once looked like the obvious choice to defend the nation, but now fear had replaced his faith. And Israel had no answer for the giant that was standing right there before them. Meanwhile, David wasn't on the battlefield. His father Jesse sent him to deliver food to his older brothers and then bring back news from the front lines. David arrived just as Goliath was issuing his daily challenge. Now, unlike everyone else, David wasn't impressed by Goliath's size. He was actually offended that someone would openly mock the God of Israel. In verse 26, we read this: "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David saw the battle differently. He saw it differently because he saw God differently. Everyone else measured Goliath against themselves. David measured Goliath against the Lord, and that's a key fact to remember as we look at what he says in this passage. And when David volunteered to fight, Saul questioned whether such a young shepherd could possibly defeat an experienced warrior. David responded by reminding Saul that God had already delivered him from lions and bears while he was protecting his father's sheep. And then David made one of the greatest declarations of faith in the Old Testament. In verse 37, he said this: "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." David's confidence wasn't rooted in his own abilities. It rested entirely on God's faithfulness. The same God who had protected him before would protect him again. Saul attempted to be at least a little bit helpful here. He equipped David with royal armor, but the scripture reveals to us that David wasn't used to wearing it, so he removed it. And instead of the armor, David took his shepherd's staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones. Now, from a human perspective, this probably looked foolish, but from God's perspective, it was exactly what God intended to use to grant a decisive victory. And as David approached Goliath, the giant laughed at him. But David answered with words that continue to inspire believers today. In verse 45, he said this: "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David understood that this battle wasn't ultimately about David versus Goliath. It was about God versus anyone who opposed his glory. And then David continued in verse 47. He said this: "The battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." And with one stone, God brought the mighty giant crashing to the ground. And David then used Goliath's own sword to literally behead him. The Philistine army then fled in fear, and Israel experienced a victory that no one else thought possible. And in addition to inspiring us with this great victory, keep in mind that this chapter is also meant to point us directly to Jesus. Many people picture themselves as David facing the giants of life. And while there's certainly applications we can make about trusting God as we face giant circumstances, that's not the primary picture we're being shown in this passage. In many ways, we're more like the frightened Israelites standing helplessly behind the battle lines. We couldn't defeat the enemy ourselves. Sin, death, and Satan were enemies far beyond our strength. Jesus is the greater David. He stepped forward as God's chosen king to fight the battle we couldn't win. Where Israel trembled before Goliath, Jesus faced temptation without sin. Where David defeated a giant with a stone, Jesus defeated sin and death through his cross and resurrection. And what looked like weakness became the greatest victory in history. And just as David's triumph became Israel's triumph, Christ's victory becomes the victory of everyone who trusts in him. This chapter also reminds us that God delights in using what the world considers weak to display his strength. David wasn't chosen because he looked like a champion. He was chosen because of God's good grace and providential direction in human affairs. The Lord had been preparing David in lonely fields long before anyone noticed him on the battlefield. Well, that should be encouraging for us, because much of God's preparation in our lives happens in ordinary, unseen places. Faithfulness in today's quiet responsibilities often prepares us for tomorrow's opportunities. We don't need to chase recognition. We simply need to walk faithfully with the Lord where He's placed us. When we face challenges that seem overwhelming, it's worth asking ourselves an important question. Are we focusing more on the size of the obstacle or on the greatness of our God? Fear grows when our attention stays fixed on the giant. Faith grows when our attention stays fixed on the Lord. David wasn't fearless because he was naturally courageous. He was courageous because he knew the character of God. His confidence rested in God's promises, God's power, and God's reputation. And the same Lord who was faithful to David remains faithful today. And because Jesus has already won the ultimate victory over sin and death, we can face every challenge with hope. The greatest battle has already been fought, and our champion has already prevailed. So whatever stands before you today, remember David's words, "The battle is the Lord's." Our confidence has never rested in our own strength. It rests in our victorious King, Jesus Christ. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Chapter a Day Bible Study. For more resources to help you in your walk with Christ and your understanding of the Bible, please visit my website at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com. And if you'd like to partner with me by becoming a supporter of this ministry, you'll see a few options to do so, again, at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com or in the description of this episode. As always, thank you for your prayers, thank you for your support, and thank you for your willingness to share this content with others. Have a great day, and I'll see you again right here tomorrow.